even to your closest friends. The enemy has many spies and many ways of you.
Suddenly he stopped as if listening. Frodo became aware that all was very quiet, inside and outside. Gandalf crept to one side of the window. Then with a dart he sprang to the sill, and thrust a long arm out and downwards. There was a squawk, and up came Sam Gamgee's curly head, hauled by one ear.
Well, well, bless my beard,
said Gandalf.
Sam Gamgee, is it now? What may you be doing?
Lord bless you, Mr. Gandalf, sir. Nothing. Leastways, I was just trimming the grass border under the window, if you follow me.
He picked up the shears and exhibited them as evidence.
I don't,
said Gandalf grimly.
It is some time since I heard the sound of your shears. How long have you been eavesdropping?
Eavesdropping, sir? I don't follow you, begging your pardon. There ain't no eaves in Bag End, and that's a fact.
Don't be a fool. What have you heard, and why did you listen?
Gandalf's eyes flashed, and his brow stuck out like bristles.
Mr. Frodo, sir!
Cried Sam, quaking.
Don't let him hurt me, sir. Don't let him turn me into anything unnatural. My old dad would take on so. I meant no harm. Oh, my honour, sir. He won't hurt you,
said Frodo, hardly able to keep from laughing, although he was himself startled and rather puzzled.
He knows as well as I do that you mean no harm. But just you up and answer his question straight away. Well, sir,
said Sam, dithering a little.
I heard a great deal that I didn't rightly understand. About an enemy, and rings, and Mr. Bilbo, sir, and dragons in a fiery mountain, and elves, sir. I listened because I couldn't help myself, if you know what I mean. Lord bless me, sir, but I do love tales of that sort. And I believe them, too, whatever Ted may say. Elves, sir, I would dearly love to see them. Couldn't you take me to see elves, sir, when you go?
Suddenly Gandalf laughed.
Come inside,
he shouted, and putting out both his arms, he lifted the astonished Sam, shears, grass clippings and all, right through the window, and stood him on the floor.
Take you to see elves, eh?
he said, eyeing Sam closely, but with a smile flickering on his face.
So you heard that Mr. Frodo is going away?
I did, sir. And that's why I choked, which you heard seemingly. I tried not to, sir, but it burst out of me. I was so upset. It can't be helped, Sam,
said Frodo sadly. He had suddenly realized that flying out of the Shire would mean more painful partings than merely saying farewell to the familiar comforts of Bag End. I shall have to go. But, and here he looked hard at Sam, if you really care about me, you will keep that dead secret. See? If you don't, if you even breathe a word of what you've heard here, then I hope Gandalf will turn you into a spotted toad and fill the garden full of grass snakes. Sam fell to his knees, trembling.
Get up, Sam,
said Gandalf.
I have thought of something better than that. Something to shut your mouth and punish you properly for listening. You shall go away with Mr. Frodo.
Me, sir,
cried Sam, springing up like a dog invited for a walk.
Me go and see elves and all. Oh, hooray!
He shouted, and then burst into tears.
You ought to go quietly, and you ought to go soon,
said Gandalf. 2 or 3 weeks had passed, and still Frodo made no sign of getting ready to go. I know, but it's difficult to do both, he objected. If I just vanished like Bilbo, the tale would be all over the Shire in no time.
Of course you mustn't vanish,
said Gandalf.
That wouldn't do at all. I said soon, not instantly. If you can think of any way of slipping out of the Shire without this being generally known, it will be worth a little delay. But you must not delay too long.
What about the autumn? On or after our birthday? Asked Frodo. I think I could probably make some arrangements by then. To tell the truth, he was very reluctant to start, now that it had come to the point. Bag End seemed a more desirable residence than it had for years, and he wanted to savor as much as he could in this last summer in the Shire. When autumn came, he knew that part at least of his heart would think more kindly of journeying, as it always did in that season. He had indeed privately made up his mind to leave on his 50th birthday. Bilbo's 128th. It seemed somehow the proper day on which to set out and follow him. Following Bilbo was uppermost in his mind, and the one thing that made the thought of leaving bearable. He thought as little as possible about the ring, and where it might lead him in the end. But he did not tell all his thoughts to Gandalf. What the wizard guessed was always difficult to tell. He looked at Frodo and smiled.
Very well,
He said,
I think that will do. But it must not be any later. I'm getting very anxious. In the meanwhile, do take care and don't let out any hint of where you are going. See that Sam Gamgee does not talk. If he does, I really shall turn him into a toad.
As for where I'm going, said Frodo, it would be difficult to give that away, for I have no clear idea myself yet.
Don't be absurd,
said Gandalf.
I'm not warning you against leaving an address at the post office, but you are leaving the Shire, and that should not be known until you are far away. And you must go, or at least set out, either north, south, west, or east, and the direction should certainly not be known.
I've been so taken up with the thought of leaving Bag End and of saying farewell that I have never even considered the direction, said Frodo. Or where am I to go? And by what shall I steer? What is to be my quest? Bilbo went to find a treasure, there and back again. But I go to lose one, and not return as far as I can see.
But you cannot see very far,
said Gandalf.
Neither can I. It may be your task to find the cracks of doom, but that quest may be for others. I do not know. At any rate, you are not ready for that long road yet.
No, indeed, said Frodo. But in the meantime, what course am I to take?
Towards danger, but not too rashly, nor too straight,
answered the wizard.
If you want my advice, make for Rivendell. That journey should not prove too perilous, though the road is less easy than it was, and it will grow worse as the year fails.
Rivendell, said Frodo. Very good. I will go east, and I will make for Rivendell. I will take Sam to visit the elves. He will be delighted. He spoke lightly, but his heart was moved suddenly with the desire to see the house of Elrond half-elven, and breathe the air of that deep valley where many of the fair folk still dwelt in peace. One summer's evening, an astonishing piece of news reached the Ivy Bush and Green Dragon. Giants and the other portents on the borders of the Shire were forgotten for more important matters. Mr. Frodo was selling Bag End. Indeed, he had already sold it to the Sackville Bagginses.
For a nice bit, too,
said some.
at a bargain price.
Said others. And that's more likely when Mistress Lobelia's the buyer. Otho had died some years before, at the ripe but disappointed age of 102. Just why Mr. Frodo was selling his beautiful hole was even more debatable than the price. A few held a theory, supported by nods and hints, of Mr. Baggins himself, that Frodo's money was running out. He was going to leave Hobbiton and live in a quiet way on the proceeds of the sale down in Buckland, among his Brandybuck relations. As far from the Sackville Bagginses as may be, some added. But so firmly fixed had the notion of the immeasurable wealth of the Bagginses of Bag End become that most found this hard to believe, harder than any other reason or unreason that their fancy could suggest. To most, it suggested a dark and yet unrevealed plot by Gandalf. Though he kept himself very quiet and did not go about by day, it was well known that he was hiding up in Bag End. But however a removal might fit with the designs of his wizardry, there was no doubt about the fact. Frodo Baggins was going back to Buckland. Yes, I shall be moving this autumn, he said. "Mary Brandybuck is looking out for a nice home for me. Or perhaps a small house." As a matter of fact, with Mary's help, he had already chosen and bought a little house at Crick Hollow in the country beyond Bucklebury. To all but Sam, he pretended he was going to settle down there permanently. The decision to set out eastwards had suggested the idea to him, for Buckland was on the eastern borders of the Shire, and as he had lived there in childhood, his going back would at least seem credible. Gandalf stayed in the Shire for over 2 months. Then one evening, at the end of June, soon after Frodo's plan had been finally arranged, he suddenly announced that he was going off again the next morning.
"Only for a short while, I hope,"
he said.
"but I'm going down beyond the southern borders to get some news if I can. I have been idle longer than I should."
He spoke lightly, but it seemed to Frodo that he looked rather worried. "Has anything happened?" he said.
"Well, no, but I have heard something that has made me anxious and needs looking into. I think it's necessary, after all, for you to get off at once. I shall come back immediately, or at least send word. In the meantime, stick to your plan. But be more careful than ever, especially of the ring. Let me impress on you once more.
He went off at dawn.
I may be back any day,"
he said.
"At the very latest, I shall come back to the farewell party. I think, after all, you may need my company on the road."
At first Frodo was a good deal disturbed, and wondered often what Gandalf could have heard. But his uneasiness wore off, and in the fine weather he forgot his troubles for a while. The Shire had seldom seen so fair a summer, or so rich an autumn. The trees were laden with apples, honey was dripping from the combs, and the corn was tall and full. Autumn was well under way before Frodo began to worry about Gandalf again. September was passing, and there was still no news of him. The birthday and the removal drew nearer, and still he did not come, or send word. Bag End began to be busy. Some of Frodo's friends came to stay and help him with the packing. There was Fredegar Bolger and Folko Boffin, and of course his special friends Pippin Tuke and Merry Brandybuck. Between them, they turned the whole place upside down. On September 20th, 2 covered carts went off laden to Buckland, conveying the furniture and goods that Frodo had not sold to his new home, by way of the Brandywine Bridge. The next day, Frodo became really anxious and kept a constant lookout for Gandalf. Thursday, his birthday morning, dawned as fair and clear as it had long ago for Bilbo's great party. Still, Gandalf did not appear. In the evening, Frodo gave his farewell feast. It was quite small, just a dinner for himself and his 4 helpers. But he was troubled, and fell in no mood for it. The thought that he would so soon have to part with his young friends weighed on his heart. He wondered how he would break it to them. The 4 younger hobbits were, however, in high spirits, and the party soon became very cheerful in spite of Gandalf's absence. The dining room was bare except for a table and chairs, but the food was good, and there was good wine. Frodo's wine had not been included in the sale to the Sackville Bagginses. "Whatever happens to the rest of my stuff when the SBs get their claws on it, at any rate, I have found a good home for this," said Frodo, as he drained his glass. It was the last drop of Old Wynyards. When they had sung many songs and talked of many things they had done together, they toasted Bilbo's birthday, and then they drank his health and Frodo's together according to Frodo's custom. Then they went out for a sniff of air, and glimpse of the stars, and then they went to bed. Frodo's party was over, and Gandalf had not come. The next morning they were busy packing another cart with the remainder of the luggage. Merry took charge of this, and drove off with Fatty, that is, Fredegar Bolger.
"Someone must get these and warm the house before you arrive,"
said Merry.
"Well, see you later. The day after tomorrow if you don't go to sleep on the way."
Folko went home after lunch, but Pippin remained behind. Frodo was restless and anxious, listening in vain for a sound of Gandalf. He decided to wait until nightfall. After that, if Gandalf wanted him urgently, he would go to Crick Hollow, and might even get there first, for Frodo was going on foot. His plan, for pleasure and a last look of the Shire as much as any other reason, was to walk from Hobbiton to Bucklebury Ferry, taking it fairly easy.
Oh, I shall get myself a bit into training too.
he said, looking at himself in a dusty mirror in the half-empty hall. He had not done any strenuous walking for a long time, and the reflection looked rather flabby, he thought. After lunch, the Sackville Bagginses, Lobelia, and her sandy-haired son Lotho turned up, much to Frodo's annoyance.
"How's at last?"
said Lobelia as she stepped inside. It was not polite nor strictly true, for the sale of Bag End did not take effect until midnight. But Lobelia can perhaps be forgiven. She had been obliged to wait about 77 years longer for Bag End than she once hoped. And she was now 100 years old. Anyway, she had come to see that nothing she had paid for had been carried off, and she wanted the keys. It took a long while to satisfy her, as she had brought a complete inventory with her, and went right through it. In the end, she departed with Lotho and the spare key, and the promise that the other key would be left at the Gamgees in Bagshot Row. She snorted, and showed plainly that she thought the Gamgees capable of plundering the whole during the night. Frodo did not offer her any tea. He took his own tea with Pippin and Sam Gamgee in the kitchen. It had been officially announced that Sam was coming back to Buckland, to do for Mr. Frodo, and look after his bit of garden, an arrangement that was approved by the gaffer, though it did not console him for the prospect of having Lobelia as a neighbour. "Our last meal at Bag End," said Frodo, pushing back his chair. They left the washing up for Lobelia. Pippin and Sam strapped up their 3 packs and piled them in the porch. Pippin went out for a last stroll in the garden. Sam disappeared. The sun went down. Bag End seemed sad and gloomy and dishevelled. Frodo wandered round the familiar rooms, and saw the light of the sunset fade on the walls, and shadows creep out of the corners. It grew slowly dark indoors. He went out and walked down to the gate at the bottom of the path, and then on a short way down the hill road. He half expected to see Gandalf come striding up through the dusk. The sky was clear and the stars were glowing bright. "It's going to be a fine night," he said aloud. "That's good for a beginning. I feel like walking. I can't bear any more hanging about. I'm going to start. And Gandalf must follow me." He turned to go back, and then stopped, for he heard voices just round the corner by the end of Bagshot Row. One voice was certainly the old gaffer's. The other was strange, and somehow unpleasant. He could not make out what it said, but he heard the gaffer's answers, which were rather shrill. The old man seemed put out.
"No, Mr. Baggins has gone away. Went this morning, and my Sam went with him. Anyway, all his stuff went. It's sold out and gone, I tell you. Why? Why? It's not none of my business. Where to? That ain't no secret. He's moved to Bucklebury or some such place, away down yonder. Yes, it is. I tried to. I've never been so far myself. Big dear folks, I can't give no message. Good night to you."
Footsteps went away down the hill. Frodo wondered vaguely why the fact that they did not come up on the hill seemed a great relief. "I am sick of questions and curiosity about my doings, I suppose," he thought. What an inquisitive lot they all are. He had half a mind to go and ask the gaffer who the inquirer was, but he thought better, or worse, and turned and walked quickly back to Bag End. Pippin was sitting on his pack in the porch. Sam was not there. Frodo stepped inside the dark door. "Sam?" he called. "Sam! Time! Come, sir!" came the answer from far within, followed soon by Sam himself, wiping his mouth. He had been saying farewell to the beer baron in the cellar. "All aboard, Sam," said Frodo. "Yes, sir. I'll ask for a bit now, sir." Frodo shut and locked the round door, and gave the key to Sam. "Run down with this to your home, Sam," he said. "Then cut along the row and meet us as quick as you can at the gate in the lane beyond the meadows. We're not going through the village tonight. Too many ears pricking and eyes prying." Sam ran off at full speed. "Well, now we're off at last," said Frodo. They shouldered their packs and took up their sticks, and walked round the corner to the west side of Bag End. "Goodbye," said Frodo, looking at the dark windows. He waved his hand, and then turned, and following Bilbo if he had known it, hurried after Peregrine down the garden path. They jumped over the low place in the hedge at the bottom, and took to the fields, passing into the darkness like a rustle in the grasses. At the bottom of the hill on its western side, they came to the gate opening on to a narrow lane. There they halted and adjusted the straps for their packs. Presently Sam appeared, trotting quickly and breathing hard. His heavy pack was hoisted high on his shoulders, and he had put on his head a tall, shapeless felt bag, which he called a hat. In the gloom, he looked very much like a dwarf.
"Sure you have given me all the heaviest stuff,"
said Frodo.
"I pity snails, and all that carry their hounds on their backs. I could take a lot more yet, sir. My packet is quite light,"
said Sam stoutly, and untruthfully.
"No, you don't, Sam.
Said Pippin.
It is good for him. He's got nothing except what he ordered us to pack. He's been slack lately, and he'll feel the weight less when he's walked off some of his own." "Kind to a poor old hobbit,"
laughed Frodo.
"I shall be as thin as a willow wand, I'm sure, before I get to Buckland."
"I was talking nonsense. I suspect you have taken more than your share, sir. And I shall look into it at our next packet." Picked up his stick again.
"Well, we all like walking in the dark,"
he said.
"so let's put some miles behind us before bed."
For a short way they followed the lane westwards. Then, leaving it, they turned left and took quietly to the fields again. They went in single file, along hedgerows and the borders of coppices, and night fell dark about them. In their dark cloaks they were as invisible as if they all had magic rings. Since they were all hobbits, and were trying to be silent, they made no noise that even hobbits would hear. Even the wild things in the fields and woods hardly noticed their passing. After some time they crossed the water, west of Hobbiton, by a narrow plank bridge. The stream was there no more than a winding black ribbon, bordered with leaning ardlet trees. A mile or two further south they hastily crossed the great road from the Brandywine Bridge. They were now in the Tukeland, and bending southeastwards they made for the Green Hill country. As they began to climb its first slopes, they looked back and saw the lamps in Hobbiton far off twinkling in the gentle valley of the water. Soon it disappeared in the folds of the darkened land, and was followed by Bywater beside its grey pool. When the light of the last farm was far behind, peeping among the trees, Frodo turned and waved a hand in farewell. "I wonder if I shall ever look down into that valley again," he said quietly. When they had walked for about 3 hours, they rested. The night was clear, cool, and starry. The smoke-like wisps of mist were creeping up the hillsides from the stream and up their hills. Thin-clad birches swaying in the light wind above their heads made a black net against the pale sky. They ate a very frugal supper, for hobbits, and then went on again. Soon they struck a narrow road that went rolling up and down, fading grey into the darkness ahead, the road to Woodhall and Stock and the Bucklebury Ferry. It climbed away from the main road in the winter and wound over the skirts of the green hills, towards Woody End, a wild corner of the east farthing. After a while they plunged into a deeply cloven track between tall trees that rustled their dry leaves in the night. It was very dark. At first they talked, or hummed a tune softly together, being now far away from inquisitive ears. Then they marched on in silence, and Pippin began to lag behind. At last they began to climb a steep slope. He stopped and yawned.
"I am so sleepy,"
he said.
"that soon I shall fall down on the road. Are you going to sleep on your legs? It's nearly midnight. I thought you liked walking in the dark,"
said Frodo.
"But there is no great hurry. Mary expects us sometime the day after tomorrow, but that leaves us nearly 2 days more. We'll halt at the first likely spot. The wind's in the west,"
said Sam.
"If we get to the other side of this hill, we shall find a spot that is sheltered and snug enough, sir. There is a dry fir wood just ahead, if I remember rightly."
Sam knew the land well within 20 miles of Hobbiton, but that was the limit of his geography. Just over the top of the hill, they came on the patch of fir wood. Leaving the road, they went into the deep resin-scented darkness of the trees,
and gathered dead sticks and cones to make a fire. Soon they had a merry crackle of flame at the foot of a large fir tree, and they sat round it for a while, until they began to nod. Then, each in an angle of the great tree's roots, they curled up in their cloaks and blankets, and were soon fast asleep. They set no watch. Even Frodo feared no danger yet, for they were still in the heart of the Shire. A few creatures came and looked at them, and the fire died away. A fox, passing through the wood on business of his own, stopped several minutes and sniffed. He thought,
Sniff. I heard of strange doings. I heard of the hobbits. Three of them. There's something mighty queer behind this.
he was quite right, but he never found out any more about it. The morning came, pale and clammy. Frodo woke up first and found that the tree root had made a hole in his back, and his neck was stiff.
Walking from why didn't I try?
He thought, as he usually did at the beginning of an expedition.
Oh, my beautiful feathered beds are sewed to the sackful beds. These tree roots would do them good.
He stretched.
Wake up, hobbits!
He cried.
It's a beautiful morning.
Oh, what's so beautiful about it?
Said Pippin, peering over the edge of his blanket with one eye.
Sam, get breakfast ready. For 9:30. Have you got the bathwater hot?
Sam jumped up, looking rather bleary.
No, sir. I haven't, sir.
He said. Frodo stripped the blankets from Pippin and rolled him over, and then walked off to the edge of the wood. There, the sun was rising red out of the mist that lay thick in the world. Touched with gold and red, the autumn trees seemed to be sailing roofless in a shadowless sea. A little below him, to the left, the road ran down steeply into a hollow. When he returned, Sam and Pippin had got a good fire going. Chattered Pippin.
I don't keep water in my pocket.
Said Frodo.
We thought you had gone to find some.
Said Pippin, busy setting out the food in cups.
You had better go now. You can come too,
Said Frodo.
and bring all the water.
There was a stream at the foot of the hill. They filled their bottles and the small camping kettle at a little fall where the water fell, a few feet over an outcrop of the wooden stone. It was icy cold, and they spluttered and puffed as they bathed their faces and hands. When their breakfast was over, their packs all trussed up again, it was after 10 o'clock. The day was beginning to turn fine. They went down the slope and across the stream where it divided under the road, and up the next slope, and up and down another shoulder of the hills. By that time, their coats, blankets, water, food, and other gear already seemed a heavy burden. The day's march promised to be warm and tiring work. After some miles, however, the road ceased to roll up and down. It climbed to the top of a steep bank in a weary, zigzagging sort of way, and then prepared to go down for the last time. In front of them, they saw the land, dotted with small clumps of trees that lifted away in the distance to a brown woodland haze. They were looking across the woody end towards the Brandywine River. The road wound away before them. They sat down on the bank at the side of the road and looked away east into the haze, beyond which lay the river, the end of the Shire. His round eyes were wide open. If he was looking across there, he had never seen it. It was really amazing.
Do elves live in those woods?
He asked.
Not that I've ever heard.
Said Pippin. Frodo was silent. He too was gazing eastward along the road, as if he had never seen it before. Suddenly he spoke, aloud but as if to himself, saying slowly, "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Pursuing it with weary feet, until it joins the same large and wide. were many paths and roads. Whither then? I cannot say.
That sounds a bit like old Bilbo climbing.
Said Pippin.
Or is it one of your imitations? It's not sound altogether encouraging.
I don't know, said Frodo. It came to me then as if I was making it up, but I may have heard it long ago. Certainly it reminds me very much of Bilbo in the last years, before he went away. He used to often say that there was only one road, and it was like a great river. Its springs were at every doorstep, and every path was its tributary. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door, he used to say. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. Do you realize that this is the very path that goes through Mirkwood, and if you let it, might take you to the Lonely Mountain, or even further and to worse places? He used to say that on the path outside the front door at Bag End, especially after he'd been out for a long walk. Well, the road won't suit me anywhere for an hour at least, said Pippin, unslinging his pack. The others followed his example, putting their packs against the bank and their legs out into the road. After a rest, they had a good lunch, and then more rest. The sun was beginning to get low, and the light afternoon was on the land as they went down the hill. So far they had not met a soul on the road. This way was not much used, being hardly fit for carts. There was little traffic to the woody end. They had been jogging along again for an hour or more, when Sam stopped for a moment as if listening. They were now on level ground, and the road, after much winding, lay straight ahead through grasslands sprinkled with tall trees, outliers of the approaching hills.
I can hear a pony or a horse coming along the road behind,
said Sam. They looked back, but the turn of the road prevented them from seeing far.
I wonder if that's Gandalf coming after us.
But even as he said it, he had a feeling not so, and a sudden desire to hide from the view of the rider.
It may not matter much,
he said apologetically, but I would rather not be seen on the road. I'm sick of my doings being noticed and discussed, and if it is Gandalf, he added as an afterthought,
we can give him a little surprise to pay him out for being so late. Let's get out of sight.
The other two ran quickly to the left and down into a little hollow not far from the road. There they lay flat. Frodo hesitated for a second. Curiosity or some other feeling was struggling with his desire to find. The sound of hoofs drew nearer. Just in time, he threw himself down in a patch of long grass behind the tree that overshadowed the road. Then he lifted his head and peered cautiously above one of the great trees. Round the corner came a black horse. No hobbit pony, but a full-sized horse. And on it sat a large man who seemed to crouch in the saddle, wrapped in a great black cloak and hood, so that only his boots and the high stirrups showed below. His face was shadowed and invisible. When it reached the tree and was level with Frodo, the horse stopped. The riding figure sat quite still with his head bowed, as if listening. From inside the hood came a noise as of someone sniffing to catch an elusive scent. The head turned from side to side of the road. A sudden, unreasoning fear of discovery laid hold on Frodo, and he thought of his ring. He hardly dared to breathe. And yet the desire to get it out of his pocket became so strong that he began slowly to move his hand. He felt that he had only to slip it on. Safe. The advice of Gandalf had seemed absurd. Bilbo had used the ring. I'm still in the Shire, he thought, as his hand touched the chain on which it hung. At that moment the rider sat up and shook the reins. The horse stepped forward, walking slowly at first, and then breaking into a quick trot. Frodo crawled out to the edge of the road and watched the rider, till he dwindled into the distance. He could not be quite sure, but it seemed to him that suddenly, before it passed out of sight, the horse turned aside and went into the trees on the right.
Well, I call that very queer. Indeed disturbing,
said Frodo to himself as he walked towards his companions. Pippin and Sam had remained flat in the grass, and had seen nothing.
So Frodo described the rider and his strange behavior. I can't say why, but I felt certain he was looking, smelling. And also I felt certain that I did not want him to discover me. I've never seen or felt anything like him in the Shire before. What has one of the big people got to do with us? Said Pippin. What is he doing in this part of the world? There are some men about, said Frodo. Down in the south part we have had trouble with big people, I believe. But I have never heard of anything like this rider. Wonder where he comes from. Begging your pardon, put in Sam suddenly. But I know where he comes from. It's from Hobbiton that this here Black Rider comes, unless there's more than one. Now I know where he's going to. What do you mean? Said Frodo sharply, looking at it in astonishment. Why did you speak up before? I've only just remembered it, sir. It was like this. When I got back to our home yesterday evening with the key, my dad, he says to me, "Hello, Sam," he says. "I thought you might be away with Mr. Frodo this morning. There's been a strange customer asking for Mr. Baggins of Bag End. He's only just gone. I've sent him to Bucklebury, and I like the sound of him. He seemed quite put out when I told him Mr. Baggins had left his own home for good. He stepped me in, big like a shudder. What sort of a fellow was he? Says I to the gaffer. I don't know, says he, but he wasn't a hobbit. He was tall and black-like, and he stooped over me. I reckon it was one of the big folk from foreign parts. He spoke funny. I couldn't stay to hear more, sir, since you were waiting. I didn't give much heed to it myself. The gaffer is getting old, and more than a bit blind. And it must have been near dark when this fellow came up the hill, and I found him taking the air at the end of our road. I hope he doesn't done no harm, sir. Nor me." The gaffer kept me laying down, said Frodo. As a matter of fact, I heard him talking to a stranger who seemed to be inquiring for me, and I nearly went to ask him who it was. I wish I had, or you had told me about it before. I might have been more careful on the road. Still, there may be no connection between the rider and the gaffer stranger, said Pippin. We left Hobbiton secretly enough, and I don't see how he could have followed us. Sir, said Sam. The gaffer said he wasn't that chap. I wish I had waited for that. Frodo muttered, but perhaps it would only have made matters worse. Then you know or guess something about this rider, said Pippin, with caught the muttered words. I don't know, and I would rather not guess, said Frodo. All right, Cousin Frodo. You can keep your secret for the present if you want to be mysterious. In the meanwhile, what are we to do? I should like a bite and a sup, but somehow I think we had better move on from here. Your talk of sniffing riders with invisible noses sounds settled me. Yes, I think we will move on, said Frodo, but not on the road, in case the rider comes back. Or another form. We ought to do a good step once. Buckland is still miles away. The shadows of the trees were long and thin on the road. They started off again. They now kept the stone's throw to the left of the road, kept out of sight of it as much as they could. This hindered them, for the grass was thick and tussocky. The ground and the trees began to draw together into thickets. The sun had gone down red behind the hills at their backs, and evening was coming on before they came back to the road at the end of the long river, over which it had run straight for some miles. At that point it went left, went down into the lowlands of the lane, making for stop. But the lane branched right, winding through a road of ancient oak trees on its way to Woodfall. That is the way for us, said Frodo. Not far from the road meeting, they came on the huge hulk of a tree. It was still alive and had leaves on the small branches that it had put out round the broken stumps of its long-clawed limbs. But it was hollow, and could be entered by a great crack in the side away from the road. The hobbits crept inside, and sat there upon a floor of old leaves and decayed wood. They rested and had a light meal, talking quietly and listening from time to time. Twilight was about them as they crept back into the lane. The west wind was sighing in the branches. Leaves were whispering. Soon the road began to fall gently, but steadily, into the dusk. A star came out above the trees in the darkening east before them. They went abreast and in step to keep up their spirits. After a time, as the stars grew thicker and brighter, the feeling of disquiet left them, and they no longer listened for the sound of hoofs. They began to hum softly, as hobbits have a way of doing as they walk along, especially when they are drawing near to home at night. With most hobbits, it is a supper song or a bed song, but these hobbits hummed a walking song, though not, of course, without any mention of supper at bed. Bilbo Baggins had made the words to a tune that was as old as the hills, and taught it to Frodo as they walked in the lanes of the Water Valley and talked about adventure.
Not yet weary or our feet, still round the corner. Sudden tree or standing stone, that none have seen but we alone. Tree and flower, leaf and grass, let them pass, hill under water, on the sky, pass them by, still round the corner there they wait, a new rose it gate. And though we pass them by today, tomorrow we may come this way and take the hidden paths that run towards the moon or to the sun. Apple, thorn, and nut and slow, let them go, Sand and stone and blue, let them fare you well, Home is behind the wall ahead, and there are many paths to tread through shadow to the edge of night. You're going to follow the stars alive. And the world behind and home ahead. Mist and twilight, cloud and shade, away shall fade, fire and lamp and meat and bread, and then to bed,
The song ended. Sang Pippin in a high voice. "Hush," said Frodo. "I think I hear hooves again." They stopped suddenly and stood as silent as tree shadows, listening. There was a sound of hoofs in a lane, some way behind, but coming slow and clear down the wind. Quickly and quietly they slipped off the path and ran into the deeper shade out of the oak trees.
"Don't let us go too far,"
said Frodo.
"I don't want to be seen, but I want to see if this is another Black Rider." "Very well,"
said Pippin.
"Don't forget the feather."
The hoofs drew nearer. They had no time to find any hiding place better than the general darkness under the trees. Sam and Pippin crouched behind a large tree bole, while Frodo crept back a few yards towards the lane. It showed grey and pale, a line of fading light through the wood. Above it the stars were thick in the dim sky, but there was no moon. The sound of hoofs stopped. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass across the lighter space between two trees, and then halt. It looked like the black shade of a horse, led by a smaller black shadow. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the path, and it swayed from side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground, and then began to crawl towards him. Once more the desire to slip on the ring came over Frodo, but this time it was stronger than before. So strong that almost before he realized what he was doing, his hand was groping in his pocket. But at that moment there came a sound like mingled song and laughter. Clear voices rose and fell in the starlit air. The black shadow straightened up and retreated. It climbed on the shadowy horse and seemed to vanish across the lane into the darkness on the other side. Frodo breathed again.
"Elves!"
exclaimed Sam in a hoarse whisper.
"Elves, sir!"
He would have burst out of the trees and dashed off towards the voices if they had not pulled him back.
"Yes, it is elves.
Said Frodo.
We can meet them sometimes in the woody end, but they wander into it in spring and autumn, out of their own lands away beyond the Tower Hills. I'm thankful that they do. You did not see, but that Black Rider stopped just here and was actually crawling towards us when the song began. As soon as he heard the voices, he slipped away." "What about the elves?"
said Sam, too excited to trouble about the rider.
"Can't we go and see them?" "Listen. They're coming this way."
Said Frodo.
"Only to wait."
The singing drew nearer. One clear voice rose now above the others. It was singing in the fair elven tongue, of which Frodo knew only a little, and the others knew nothing. Yet the sound blending with the melody seemed to shape itself in their thought into words which they only partly understood. This was the song as Frodo heard it. Snow White, O Lady clear, O Queen beyond the western seas, O light to us that wander here, amid the world of woven trees. Gilthorniel, O Elbereth, clear are thy eyes, and bright thy breath. Snow White, we sing to thee in a far land beyond the sea. O stars in the sunless year, with shining hand by her were sown, in windy fields now bright and clear, we see your silver blossom blown. O Elbereth Gilthorniel, we still remember we who dwell in this far land beneath the trees, thy starlight on the western seas. The song ended.
These are high elves. They spoke the name of Elbereth,
said Frodo in amazement.
You of the fairest folk are ever seen in the Shire. Not many now remain in Middle-earth, east of the Great Sea. This is indeed a strange chance.
The hobbits sat in shadow by the wayside. Before long, the elves came down the lane towards the valley. They passed slowly, and the hobbits could see the starlight glimmering on their hair and in their eyes. They bore no lights, yet as they walked, a shimmer, like the light of the moon above the rim of the hills before it rises, seemed to fall about their feet. They were now silent, and as the last elf passed, he turned and looked towards the hobbits and laughed.
"Hail, Frodo!"
he cried.
"You are abroad late. Or are you perhaps lost?"
Then he called aloud to the others, and all the company stopped and gathered round.
"This is indeed wonderful,"
they said.
3 hobbits in a wood at night. We have not seen such a thing since Bilbo went away. What is the meaning of it?"
The meaning of it, fair people,
said Frodo.
"Is simply that we seem to be going the same way as you are. I like walking under the stars, but I would welcome your company." "We have no need for other company, and hobbits are so dull."
They laughed.
"And how do you know that we go the same way as you, for you do not know whither we are going?"
And how do you know my name?
asked Frodo in return.
"We know many things.
They said.
We have seen you often before with Bilbo, though you may not have seen us."
Who are you, and who is your lord?
asked Frodo.
"I am Gildor,"
answered their leader, the elf who had first hailed him.
"Gildor and Glorian of the House of Finrod. We are exiles, and most of our kindred have long ago departed, and we too are now only tarrying here a while, ere we return over the great sea. But some of our kinsfolk dwell still in peace in Rivendell. Come now, Frodo, tell us what you are doing, for we see that there is some shadow of fear upon you." "All wise people,"
interrupted Pippin eagerly.
"tell us about the Black Riders."
Black Riders, they said in low voices.
"Why do you ask about Black Riders?" "Because 2 Black Riders have overtaken us today. Or one has done so twice.
said Pippin.
Only a little while ago he slipped away as you drew near."
The elves did not answer at once, but spoke together softly in their own tongue. At length Gildor turned to the hobbits.
"We will not speak of this here,"
he said.
"We think you had best come now with us. It is not our custom, but for this time we will take you on your road, and you shall lodge with us tonight if you will." "Oh, fair folk! This is good fortune beyond my hope,"
said Pippin. Sam was speechless.
"I thank you indeed, Gildor and Glorian,"
said Frodo, bowing.
"Elen sila lumen, omentielve. Our star shines on the hour of our meeting,"
he added in high elven speech.
"Be careful, friends,"
cried Gildor, laughing.
"Speak no secrets. Here is a scholar in the ancient tongue. Bilbo was a good master. Hail, elf friend,"
he said, bowing to Frodo.
"Come now with your friends and join our company. You had best walk in the middle so that you may not stray. You may be weary before we halt." "Why, where are you going?"
asked Frodo.
"For tonight we shall go to the woods on the hills above Footfall. It is some miles, but you shall have rest at the end of it, and it will shorten your journey tomorrow."
They now marched on again in silence, and passed like shadows in faint light. For elves, even more than hobbits, could walk when they wished without sound or footfall. Pippin soon began to feel sleepy, and staggered once or twice, but each time a tall elf at his side put out his arm and saved him from a fall. Sam walked along Frodo's side, as if in a dream, with an expression on his face, half of fear and half of astonished joy. The woods on either side became denser. The trees were now younger and thicker, and as the lane went lower, running down into a fold of the hills, there were many deep breaks of hazel on the rising slopes at either hand. At last the elves turned aside from the path. A green ride lay almost unseen through the thickets on the right, and this they followed as it would, away back up the wooded slopes on the top of a shoulder of the hills that stood out into the lower land of the river valley. Suddenly they came out of the shadow of the trees, and beyond them lay a wide space of grass, grey under the night. On three sides the woods pressed upon it, but eastward the ground fell steeply, and the tops of the dark trees, growing at the bottom of the slope, were below their feet. Beyond, the low lands lay dim and flat under the stars. Nearer at hand, a few lights twinkled in the village of Woodhall. The elves sat on the grass and spoke together in soft voices. They seemed to take no further notice of the hobbits. Frodo and his companions wrapped themselves in cloaks and blankets, and drowsiness stole over them. The night grew on, and the lights in the valley went out. Pippin fell asleep, pillowed on a green hillock. Away high in the east swung Remirath, the netted stars, and slowly above the mists, red Borgil rose, glowing like a jewel of fire. Then, by some shift of airs, all the mists was drawn away like a veil, and there leaned up, as he climbed over the rim of the world, the swordsman of the sky, Menelvagor with his shining belt. The elves all burst into song. Suddenly, under the trees, a fire sprang up with a red light.
Made a profit?
Come, the elves called to the hobbits. Come, now is the time for speech and merriment. Pippin sat up and rubbed his eyes. He shivered. There is a fire in the hall, and food for hungry guests, said an elf standing before him. At the south end of the greensward there was an opening. There the green floor ran into the wood, and formed a wide space like a hall, roofed by the boughs of trees. Their great trunks ran like pillars down each side. In the middle there was a wood fire blazing, and upon the tree pillars torches with lights of gold and silver were burning steadily. The elves sat round the fire upon the grass, or upon the sawn rings of old trunks. Some went to and fro bearing cups and pouring drink. Others brought food on heaped plates and dishes. Well, this is poor fare, they said to the hobbits, for we are lodging in the greensward far from our halls. If ever you are our guests at home, we will treat you better. It seems to me good enough for a birthday party, said Frodo. Pippin afterwards recalled little of either food or drink, for his mind was filled with the light upon the elf faces, and the sound of voices so various and so beautiful that he felt in a waking dream. But he remembered that there was bread, surpassing the savour of a fair white loaf to one who is starving, and fruits sweet as wild berries, and richer than the tended fruits of gardens. He drained a cup that was filled with fragrant draught, cool as a clear fountain, golden as a summer afternoon. Sam could never describe in words, nor picture clearly to himself, what he felt or thought that night, though it remained in his memory as one of the chief events of his life. The nearest he ever got was to say,
Well, sir, if I could grow apples like that, I would call myself a gardener. But it was the singing that went to my heart, if you know what I mean.
Frodo sat, eating, drinking and talking with delight, but his mind was chiefly on the words spoken. He knew a little of the elf speech and listened eagerly. Now and again he spoke to those that served him, and thanked them in their own language. They smiled at him and said, laughing, Here is a jewel among hobbits. After a while Pippin fell fast asleep, and was lifted up and borne away to a bower under the trees. There he was laid upon a soft bed, and slept the rest of the night away. Sam refused to leave his master. When Pippin had gone, he came and sat curled up at Frodo's feet, where at last he nodded and closed his eyes. Frodo remained long awake, talking with Gildor. They spoke of many things, old and new, and Frodo questioned Gildor much about happenings in the wide world outside of the Shire.
The tidings were mostly sad and ominous, of gathering darkness, the wars of men, and the flight of the elves. At last Frodo asked the question that was nearest to his heart.
Tell me, Gildor, have you ever seen Bilbo since he left us?
Gildor smiled. Yes, he answered. Twice.
He said farewell to us on this very spot.
But I saw him once again, far from here. He would say no more about Bilbo, and Frodo fell silent. You do not ask me or tell me much that concerns yourself, Frodo, said Gildor. But I already know a little, and I can read more in your face and in the thought behind your questions. You are leaving the Shire, and yet you doubt that you will find what you seek, or accomplish what you intend, or that you will ever return. Is that not so?
It is,
said Frodo.
But I thought my going was a secret known only to Gandalf and my faithful Sam.
He looked down at Sam, who was snoring gently. The secret will not reach the enemy from us, said Gildor.
The enemy?
Said Frodo.
Then you know why I'm leaving the Shire.
I do not know what reason the enemy is pursuing you, answered Gildor. But I perceive that he is. Strange indeed though that seems to me. And I warn you that peril is now both before you and behind you, and upon either side.
You mean the Riders? I fear that they were servants of the enemy. What are the Black Riders?
Has Gandalf told you nothing?
Nothing about such creatures.
Then I think it is not for me to say more, lest terror should keep you from your journey. For it seems to me that you have set out only just in time, if indeed you are in time. You must now make haste, and neither stay nor turn back, for the Shire is no longer any protection to you.
I cannot imagine what information would be more terrifying than your hints and warnings,
exclaimed Frodo.
I knew that danger lay ahead, of course, but I did not expect to meet it in our own Shire. Can't a hobbit walk from the water to the river in peace?
But it is not your own Shire, said Gildor. Others dwelt there before hobbits were, and others will dwell there again when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out.
I know, and yet it has always seemed so safe and familiar. What can I do now? My plan was to leave the Shire secretly and make my way to Rivendell, but now my footsteps are dogged before I ever get to Buckland.
I think you should still follow that plan, said Gildor. I do not think the road would prove too hard for your courage, but if you desire clearer counsel, you should ask Gandalf. I do not know the reason for your flight. These things Gandalf must know. I suppose that you will see him before you leave the Shire?
I hope so. But that is another thing that makes me anxious. I've been expecting Gandalf for many days. He was to have come to Hobbiton at the latest 2 nights ago, but he has never appeared. Now I am wondering what can have happened. Should I wait for him?
Gildor was silent for a moment.
I don't like this news, he said at last. That Gandalf will be late does not bode well.
But it is said, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours. To go or wait.
And it is also said,
answered Frodo,
go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes.
Is it indeed? Laughed Gilgalad. Elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But what would you do? You have not told me all concerning yourself, and how then shall I choose better than you?
But if you demand advice, I will, for friendship's sake, give it. I think you should now go at once, without delay, and if Gandalf does not come before you set out, then I also advise this. Do not go alone. Take such friends as are trusted and willing. Now you should be grateful, for I do not give this counsel gladly. The elves have their own labours and their own sorrows. They are little concerned with the ways of hobbits, or of any other creatures upon earth. Our paths cross there seldom, by chance or purpose. In this meeting there may be more than chance, but the purpose is not clear to me, and I fear to say too much.
I am deeply grateful,
said Frodo.
But I wish you could tell me plainly what the Black Riders are. If I take your advice, I may not see Gandalf for a long while, and I ought to know what is the danger that pursues me.
Is it not enough to know that they are servants of the enemy? Answered Gildor. Flee them! Speak no words to them. They are deadly. Ask no more of me. But my heart forebodes that, ere all is ended, you, Frodo, son of Drogo, will know more of these fell things than Gillian and Glorian. May Elbereth protect you.
But where shall I find courage?
Asked Frodo.
That is what I chiefly need.
Courage is found in unlikely places, said Gildor. Be of good hope. Sleep then. In the morning we shall have gone, but we will send our messages through the land. The wandering company shall know of your journey, and those that have power for good shall be on the watch. I name you Elf Friend, and may the stars shine upon the end of your road. Seldom have we had such delight in strangers, and it is fair to hear words of the ancient speech from the lips of other wanderers in the world. Frodo felt sleep coming upon him, even as Gildor finished speaking. He said, and the elf led him to a bower beside him. And he threw himself upon a bed, and at once into a dreamless slumber. In the morning, Frodo woke refreshed. He was lying in a bower made by a living tree with branches laced and drooping to the ground. His bed was of fern and grass, deep and soft, and strangely fragrant. The sun was shining through the fluttering leaves, which were still green upon the tree. He jumped up and went out. Sam was sitting on the grass near the edge of the wood. Pippin was standing, studying the sky and weather. There was no sign of the elves.
They've left us food and drink, said Pippin. Come and have your breakfast. The bread tastes almost as good as it did last night. I did not want to leave you any, but Sam insisted.
Frodo sat down beside Sam and began to eat.
What is the plan for today?
Asked Pippin. Walk to Buckleberry as quick as possible, answered Frodo, and gave his attention to the food.
Do you think we shall see anything of those riders?
Asked Pippin cheerfully. Under the morning sun, the prospect of seeing a whole troop of them did not seem very alarming to him.
Yes, probably,
said Frodo, not liking the reminder.
but I hope to get across the river without their seeing us.
Did you find anything about them from Gildor?
Not much, only hints and riddles,
said Frodo evasively.
Did you ask about the sniffing? We didn't discuss it,
said Frodo with his mouth full.
Oh, you should have. I'm sure it is very important. In that case, I'm sure Gildor would have refused to explain,
said Frodo sharply.
And now leave me in peace for a bit. I don't want to answer a string of questions while I'm eating. I want to think. Good heavens,
said Pippin.
at breakfast?
He walked away toward the edge of the green. From Frodo's mind, the bright morning, treacherously bright, he thought, had not banished the fear of pursuit, and he pondered the words of Gildor. The merry voice of Pippin came to him. He was running on the green turf and singing.
Could not,
he said to himself.
It is one thing to take my young friends walking over the Shire with me until we are hungry and weary, and food and bed are sweet. To take them into exile, where hunger and weariness may have no cures. Even if they are willing to come, the inheritance is mine alone. I don't think I ought even to take Sam.
He looked at Sam Gamgee and discovered that Sam was watching him.
Well, Sam,
He said,
what about it? I am leaving the Shire as soon as ever I can. In fact, I have made my mind now not even to wait a day at Crickhollow, if it can be helped. Very good, sir. You still mean to come with me? I do. It is going to be very dangerous. It is already dangerous. Most likely neither of us will come back. If you don't come back, sir, then I shall. That's certain,
said Sam.
Don't you leave him, they said to me. Leave him, I said. Never meant to. I'm going with him. If he climbs to the moon, and if any of those Black Riders try to stop him, I'll have Sam Gamgee to reckon with.
They laughed.
Who are they, and what are you talking about?
The elves, sir. We had some talk last night, and they seemed to know you were going away. So I didn't see the use of denying it. Wonderful folk elves are, sir. Wonderful.
They are, said Frodo. Do you like them still now you have had a closer view?
They seem a bit above my likes. Dislikes.
Please, answered Sam slowly.
It don't seem to matter what I think of them. Quite different from what I expected. So old and young, and so gay and sad.
Frodo looked at Sam rather startled, half expecting to see some outward sign of the odd change that seemed to have come over him. It did not sound like the voice of the old Sam Gamgee that he thought he knew, but it looked like the old Sam Gamgee sitting there, except that his face was unusually thoughtful.
Do you feel any need to leave the Shire now that your wish to see them has come true already? He asked.
Yes, sir. I don't know how to say it, but after last night, I feel different. I seem to see ahead in a kind of way. I know we're going to take a very long road into darkness, but I know I can't turn back. It isn't to see elves now, nor dragons, nor mountains that I want. I don't rightly know what I want, but I have something to do with it. It lies ahead. Not in the Shire. In the sea, sir.
I don't altogether, but I understand that Gandalf chose me critically. I'm content. We will go together.
Frodo finished his breakfast in silence. Then, standing up, he looked over the land ahead and called to Pippin.
All ready to start?
He said as Pippin ran up.
We must be getting off at once.
We slept late, and there are a good many miles to go.
You slept late, you mean? Said Pippin.
I was up long before, and we are only waiting for you to finish eating and thinking.
I have finished both now, and I'm going to make for Buckleberry Ferry as quick as possible.
I'm not going out of the way. Back to the road we left last night. I'm going to cut straight across country from here.
Then you are going to fly, said Pippin.
You won't cut straight on foot anywhere in this country. We can cut straight to the road anyway,
answered Frodo.
The ferry is east from Woodhall, but the hard road curves away to the left. You can see a bend of it away north over there. It goes round the north end of the Marish so as to strike the causeway from the bridge above Stop, but that is miles out of the way. We could save a quarter of the distance if we made a line for the ferry from where we stand. Shortcuts make long delays,
argued Pippin.
The country is rough around here, and there are bogs and all kinds of difficulties down in the Marish. I know the landings well, and if you are worrying about black riders, I can't see it as any worse meeting them on a road than in the wood or a field.
It is less easy to find people in the woods and fields,
answered Frodo.
And if you're supposed to be on the road, there's some chance that you will be looked for on the road and not off it.
All right, said Pippin.
I will follow you into every bog and ditch, but it is hard. I had counted on passing the Golden Perch at Stop before sundown. The best beer in the East Farthing. Or it used to be. It was a long time since I tasted it. Well, that settles it,
said Frodo.
Shortcuts make delays, but inns make longer ones. At all costs, we must keep you away from the Golden Perch. We want to get to Buckleberry before dark. What do you say, Sam?
I will go along with you, Mr. Frodo,
said Sam, in spite of private misgiving and a deep regret for the best beer in the East Farthing.
Then if we are going to toil through bog and briar, let's go now,
said Pippin. It was already nearly as hot as it had been the day before, but clouds were beginning to come up from the west. It looked likely to turn to rain. The hobbits scrambled down a deep green bank and plunged into the thick trees below. Their course had been chosen to leave Woodhall on their left, and to cut slanting through the woods that clustered along the eastern side of the hills, until they reached the flats beyond. Then they could make straight for the ferry, over country that was open, except for a few ditches and fences. Frodo reckoned they had 18 miles to go in a straight line. He soon found that the thicket was closer and more tangled than it had appeared. There were no paths in the undergrowth, and they did not get on very fast. When they had struggled to the bottom of the bank, they found a stream running down from the hills behind in a deeply dug bed with steep, slippery sides overhung with brambles. Most inconveniently, It cut across the line they had chosen. They could not jump over it, nor indeed get across it at all without getting wet, scratched and muddy. They halted, wondering what to do.
First check,
Said Pippin, smiling grimly. Sam Gamgee looked back. Through an opening in the trees, he caught a glimpse of the top of a green bank from which they had climbed down.
Look!
He said, clutching Frodo by the arm. They all looked. And on the edge high above them, they saw against the sky a horse standing. Beside it stooped a black figure. They at once gave up any idea of going back. Frodo led the way, and plunged quickly into the thick bushes behind the stream. He said to Pippin,
We were both right. The shortcut had gone crooked already. We got undercover only just in time. You got sharp ears, Sam. Can you hear anything coming?
They stood still, almost holding their breath as they listened. But there was no sound of pursuit,
I don't fancy he would try bringing his horse down that bank.
said Sam.
Yes, he knows we came down it. We had better be going on.
Going on was not altogether easy. They had packs to carry, and the bushes and brambles were reluctant to let them through. They were cut off from the wind by the ridge behind, and the air was still and stuffy. When they forced their way at last into more open ground, they were hot and tired, and very scratched, and they were also no longer certain of the direction in which they were going. The banks of the stream sank as it reached the levels, and became broader and shallower, wandering off towards the Marish and the river.
Why, this is Stockbrook,
Said Pippin.
If we're going to try and get back onto our course, we must cross it once and bear right.
They waded the stream, and hurried over a wide open space, rush-grown and treeless on the further side. Beyond that, they came again to a belt of trees, tall oaks for the most part, with here and there an elm tree or an ash. The ground was fairly level, and there was little undergrowth. But the trees were too close for them to see far ahead. The leaves blew upwards in sudden gusts of wind, and spouts of rain began to fall from the overcast sky. Then the wind died away, and the rain came streaming down. They trudged along as fast as they could, over patches of grass and through thick drifts of old leaves, and all about them the rain pattered and trickled. It did not talk, but kept glancing back and from side to side. After half an hour, Pippin said,
I hope you have not turned too much towards the south. We are not walking long ways through this wood. It is not a very broad belt. I should have said no more than a mile at the widest. And we ought to have been through it by now. It's no good our starting to go in zigzags.
said Frodo.
That won't mend matters. Let us keep on as we are going. I'm not sure that I want to come out into the open yet.
They went on for perhaps another couple of miles. Then the sun gleamed out of ragged clouds again, and the rain lessened. It was now past midday, and they felt it was high time for lunch. They halted under an elm tree. Its leaves, though fast turning yellow, were still thick, and the ground at its feet was fairly dry and sheltered. When they came to make their meal, they found that the elves had filled their bottles with a clear drink, pale golden in colour. It had the scent of a honey made of many flowers, and was wonderfully refreshing. Very soon they were laughing, and snapping their fingers at rain and at black riders. The last few miles, they felt, would soon be behind them. Frodo propped his back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes. Sam and Pippin sat near, and they began to hum, and then to sing softly.
Ho, ho, to the bottle I go, to heal my heart and drown my woe. Rain may fall and wind may blow, and many miles we still to go. But under a tall tree I will lie, and let the clouds go sailing by. Ho, 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 to the bottle I go.
They began again louder. They stopped short suddenly. Frodo sprang to his feet. A long-drawn wail came down the wind, like the cry of some evil and lonely creature. It rose and fell, and ended on a high, piercing note. Even as they sat and stood, as if suddenly frozen, it was answered by another cry, fainter and further off, but no less chilling to the blood. There was then a silence. broken only by the sound of the wind and the leaves. What do you think that was? Pippin asked at last, trying to speak lightly, but quavering a little. If it was a bird, it was one that I have never heard in the Shire before. It was not a bird or beast, said Frodo. It was a call, or a signal. There were words in that cry, though I could not catch them. But no hobbit has such a voice. No more was said about it. They were all thinking of the riders, but no one spoke of them. They were now reluctant either to stay or go on, but sooner or later they had got to get across the open country to the ferry, and it was best to go sooner and in daylight. In a few moments they had shouldered their packs again and were off. Before long the wood came to a sudden end. Wide grasslands stretched before them. They now saw that they had, in fact, turned too much to the south. Away over the flats they could glimpse the low hill of Buckleberry across the river. But it was now to their left. Creeping cautiously out from the edge of the trees, they set off across the open as quickly as they could. At first they felt afraid. Away from the shelter of the wood, far back behind them stood the high place where they had breakfasted. Frodo half expected to see a small distant figure of a horseman on the ridge, dark against the sky. But there was no sign of one. The sun, escaping from the breaking clouds, as it sank towards the hills they had left, was now shining brightly again. Their fear left them, though they still felt uneasy. But the land became steadily more tame and well-ordered. Soon they came into well-tended fields and meadows. There were hedges and gates and dikes for drainage. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful, just an ordinary corner of the Shire. Their spirits rose with every step. The line of the river grew nearer, and the Black Riders began to seem like phantoms of the woods now left far behind. They passed along the edge of a huge turnip field, and came to a stout gate. Beyond it, a rutted lane ran between low, well-laid hedges towards a distant clump of trees. Pippin stopped.
I know these fields and this gate,
He said,
This is Furlong, old Farmer Maggot's land. That's his farm away there in the trees. Oh, one trouble after another.
said Frodo, looking nearly as much alarmed as if Pippin had declared the lane was the slot leading to a dragon's den. The others looked at him in surprise.
What's wrong with old Maggot?
Asked Pippin.
He's a good friend to all the brandybucks. First there's a terror to trespassers and keeps ferocious stalks. But after all, folk down here are near the border and have to be more on their guard. I know,
said Frodo.
but all the same,
He added with a shamefaced laugh.
I'm terrified of him and his stalks. I've avoided this farm for years and years. He caught me several times trespassing after mushrooms when I was younger at Brandy Hall. On the last occasion, he beat me, and then took me and showed me to his stalks. See, lads, he said, next time this young varmint sets foot on my land, you can eat him. Now see him off. And they chased me all the way to the ferry. I never got over the fright. Though I dare say the beasts knew their business and would not really have touched me.
Pippin laughed.
Well, it's time you made it up, especially if you're coming back to live in Buckland. Old Maggot is really a stout fellow, if you leave his mushrooms alone. Let's get into the lane, and then we shan't be trespassing. If we meet him, I'll do the talking. He's a friend of Mary's, and I used to come here with him a good deal at one time.
They went along the lane, until they saw the thatched roofs of a large house and farm buildings peeping out among the trees ahead. The Maggots and the Puddiefoots of stock, and most of the inhabitants of the Marish, were house-dwellers. And this farm was stoutly built of brick, and had a high wall all around it. There was a wide wooden gate opening out of the wall into the lane. As they drew nearer, a terrific baying and barking broke out, and a loud voice was heard shouting, Frodo and Sam stopped dead, but Pippin walked on a few paces. The gate opened, and 3 huge dogs came pelting out into the lane, and dashed towards the travellers, barking fiercely. They took no notice of Pippin, but Sam shrank against the wall, while 2 wolvish-looking dogs sniffed at him suspiciously, and snarled if he moved. The largest and most ferocious of the 3 halted in front of Frodo, bristling and growling. Through the gate there now appeared a broad, thick-set hobbit with a round red face.
Hello, hello.
And who may you be, and what may you be wanting?
He asked,
Good afternoon, Minister Maggot.
said Pippin. The farmer looked at him closely.
Well, if it isn't Master Pippin! Mr. Peregrine Took, I should say.
He cried, changing from a scowl to a grin.
It's a long time since I saw you round here. It's lucky for you that I know you. I was just going out to set my dogs on any strangers. There are some funny things going on today. Of course, we do get queer folk wandering in these parts at times, too near the river.
He said, shaking his head.
But this fella was the most outlandish I've ever set eyes on. He won't cross my land without leave a second time, not if I can stop it.
What fellow do you mean?
Then you haven't seen him,
said the farmer.
He went up the lane towards the causeway not a long while back. Well, he was a funny customer and asking funny questions. But perhaps you'll come along inside and we'll pass the news more comfortable. I have a drop of good ale on tap, if you and your friends are willing, Mr. Duke.
It seemed plain that the farmer would tell them more, if allowed to do it in his own time and fashion. So they all accepted the invitation.
What about the dogs?
Asked Frodo anxiously. The farmer laughed.
They won't harm you, not unless I tell them to. There, rip, bang, heel,
He cried.
heel, wolf.
To the relief of Frodo and Sam, the dogs walked away and let them go free. Pippin introduced the other two to the farmer.
Mr. Frodo Baggins.
He said.
You may not remember him, but he used to live at Brandy Hall.
At the name Baggins, the farmer started and gave Frodo a sharp glance. For a moment, Frodo thought that the memory of stolen mushrooms had been aroused and that the dogs would be told to see him off. But Farmer Maggot took him by the arm.
Well, if that isn't queerer than ever.
He exclaimed.
Mr. Baggins, is it? Come inside. We must have a talk.
They went into the farmer's kitchen and sat by the wide fireplace. Mrs. Maggot brought out beer in a huge jug and filled 4 large mugs. It was a good brew. Pippin found himself more than compensated for missing the golden perch. Sam sipped his beer suspiciously. He had a natural mistrust of the inhabitants of other parts of the Shire, and also he was not disposed to be quick friends with anyone who had beaten his master, however long ago. After a few remarks about the weather and the agricultural prospects, which were no worse than usual, Farmer Maggot put down his mug and looked at them all in turn.
Now, Mr. Peregrine,
He said,
where might you be going from and where might you be going to? Were you coming to visit me? For if so, you had gone past my gate without my seeing you.
Well, no.
answered Pippin.
To tell you the truth, since you have guessed it, we got into the lane from the other end. We had come over your fields, but that was quite by accident. We lost our way in the woods back near Woodhall, trying to get a shortcut to the ferry.
Well, if you were in a hurry, the road would have served you better,
Said the farmer.
but I wasn't worrying about that. You have leave to walk over my land, if you have a mind, Mr. Peregrine. And you, Mr. Baggins, though I dare say you still like mushrooms.
He laughed.
Ah, yes, I recognize the name. I recollect the time when young Frodo Baggins was one of the worst young rascals in Buckland. But it wasn't the mushrooms I was thinking. I just heard the name Baggins before you turned up. What do you think that funny customer asked me?
They waited anxiously for him to go on.
Well,
The farmer continued, approaching his point with slow relish.
he came riding on a big black horse, in at the gate, which happened to be open, and right up to my door. All black he was himself too, and cloaked and hooded up as if he did not want to be known. Now what in the Shire can they want? I thought to myself. We don't see many of the big folk over the border. And anyway, I had never heard of any like this black fellow. Good day to you, I says, going out to her. This lane don't lead anywhere, and wherever you may be going, your quickest way will be back to the road. I didn't like the looks of him. Rip came out, he took one sniff, and let out a yelp as if he had been stung. They put down his tail and bolted off howling. The black fellow sat quite still. I come from yonder, he said, slow and stiff-like, pointing back west, over my fields, if you please. Have you seen Baggins? He asked in a queer voice, and
bent down towards me. I could not see any face, for his hood fell down so low, and I felt a sort of shiver down my back. But I did not see why he should come riding over my land, so bold. "Be off," I said. "There are no Bagginses here. You're in the wrong part of the Shire. You had better go back west to Hobbiton, but you can go by road this time." "Baggins has left," he answered in a whisper. "He is coming. He is not far away. I wish to find him. If he passes, will you tell me? I will come back with gold." "No, you won't," I said. "You'll go back where you belong, double quick. I'll give you 1 minute before I call all my ducks." He gave a sort of hiss. It might have been laughing, and it might not. Then he spurred his great horse right at me, and I jumped out of the way only just in time. I called the dogs, but he swung off. He rode through the gate and up the lane towards the causeway, like a bolt of thunder. What do you think of that?
Frodo sat for a moment looking at the fire, but his only thought was how on earth would they reach the ferry. "I don't know what to think," he said at last.
Then I'll tell you what to think, said Maggot. "You should never have gone mixing yourself up with Hobbiton folk, Mr. Frodo. Folk are queer up there."
Sam stirred in his chair and looked at the farmer with an unfriendly eye.
"But you were always a reckless lad. When I heard you had left the brandy box and gone off to that old Mr. Bilbo, I said that you were going to find trouble. Mark my words, this all comes from those strange doings of Mr. Bilbo's. His money was got in some strange fashioning for him, as they say. Maybe there is some that want to know what has become of the golden jewels that he found buried in the hill in Hobbiton, as I hear."
Frodo said nothing. The shrewd guesses of the farmer were rather disconcerting.
"Well, Mr. Frodo," Maggot went on, "I'm glad that you've made the sense to come back to Button. My advice is, stay there. Don't get mixed up with these outlandish folk. You'll have friends in these parts. If any of these black fellows come after you again, I'll deal with them. I'll say you're dead, or I've left the Shire, or anything you like. For as like as not, it is old Mr. Bilbo they want news of."
"Maybe you're right," said Frodo, avoiding the farmer's eye and staring at the fire. Maggot looked at him thoughtfully.
"Well, I see you have ideas of your own," he said. "It is as plain as my nose that no accident brought you and that rider here on the same afternoon. Maybe my news was no great news to you, after all. I'm not asking you to tell me anything you have a mind to keep to yourself. I see you are in some kind of trouble. Perhaps you're thinking it won't be too easy to get to the ferry without being caught."
"I was thinking so," said Frodo. "But we have got to try and get there, and it won't be done by sitting and thinking. So I'm afraid we must be going. Thank you very much indeed for your kindness. I've been in terror of you and your dogs for over 30 years, Farmer Maggot, though you may laugh to hear it. It's a pity, for I've missed a good friend. And now, I'm sorry to leave you so soon, but I'll come back, perhaps one day, if I get the chance."
"You'll be welcome when you come," said Maggot. "But now I've a notion. It's near sundown already. We're going to have our supper, for we mostly go to bed soon after the sun. If you and Mr. Peregrine and all would stay and have a bite with us, we would be pleased."
"And so should we," said Frodo. "But we must be going at once, I'm afraid. Even now, it will be dark before we can reach the ferry."
But wait a minute. I was going to say, after a bit of supper, I'll get out a small wagon, and I'll drive you all to the ferry, and that will save you a good step, and it might also save you trouble of another sort.
Frodo now accepted the invitation gracefully. To the relief of Pippin and Sam, the sun was already behind the western hills, and the light was failing. 2 of Maggot's sons and his 3 daughters came in, and a generous supper was laid on the large table. The kitchen was lit with candles, and the fire was mended. Mrs. Maggot bustled in and out. 1 or 2 other hobbits belonging to the farm household came in. In a short while, 14 sat down to eat. There was beer aplenty, and a mighty dish of mushrooms and bacon, besides much other solid farmhouse fare. The dogs lay by the fire and gnawed rinds and cracked bones. When they had finished, the farmer and his sons went out with a lantern and got the wagon ready. It was dark in the yard when the guests came out. They threw their packs on board and climbed in. The farmer sat in the driving seat and whipped up his 2 stout ponies. His wife stood in the light of the open door.
"You be careful of yourself, Maggot.
She called,
Don't go arguing with any foreigners and come straight back."
"I will," said he, and drove out of the gate. There was now no breath of wind stirring. The night was still and quiet, and a chill was in the air. They went without lights and took it slowly. After a mile or two, the lane came to an end, crossing a deep dike, and climbing a short slope up on to the high-banked causeway. Maggot got down and took a good look either way, north and south. But nothing could be seen in the darkness, and there was not a sound in the still air. Thin strands of river mist were hanging above the dikes and crawling over the fields.
"It's going to be thick," said Maggot, "but I'll not light my lantern till I turn for home. We'll hear anything on the road long before we meet it tonight."
It was 5 miles or more from Maggot's Lane to the ferry. The hobbits wrapped themselves up, but their ears were strained for any sound above the creak of the wheels and the slow clop of the pony's hoofs. The wagon seemed slower than a snail to Frodo. Beside him, Pippin was nodding towards sleep, but Sam was staring forwards into the rising fog. They reached the entrance to the ferry lane at last. It was marked by 2 tall white posts that suddenly loomed up on their right. Farmer Maggot drew in his ponies, and the wagon creaked to a halt. They were just beginning to scramble out, when suddenly they heard what they had all been dreading. Hoofs on the road ahead. The sound was coming towards them. Maggot jumped down and stood holding the ponies' heads and peering forward into the gloom. Clip-clop, clip-clop, came the approaching rider. The fall of the hoofs sounded loud in the still foggy air.
"You'd better be hidden, Mr. Frodo,"
said Sam anxiously.
"You get down in the wagon and cover up with blankets, and we'll send this rider to the right-abouts."
He climbed out and went to the farmer's side. Black riders would have to ride over him to get near the wagon. Clop, 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 clop. The rider was nearly on them.
"Hello there,"
said the farmer, throwing the reins to Sam and striding forward.
"Don't you come a step nearer. What do you want, and where are you going?" "I want Mr. Baggins. Have you seen him?"
But the voice was the voice of Mary Brandybuck. A dark lantern was uncovered, and its light fell on the astonished face of the farmer.
"Mr. Merry!"
He cried.
"Yes, of course. Who did you think it was?"
Frodo sprang out of the wagon to greet him.
"So there you are at last,"
Said Mary.
"I was beginning to wonder if you would turn up at all today. And I was just going back to supper. When it grew foggy, I came across the road towards Stock to see if you had fallen in any ditches. But I'm blessed if I know which way you have come. Where'd you find them, Mr. Maggot? In your duck pond?"
"No, I caught on trespassing,"
said the farmer.
"Nearly set my dogs on him. But they'll tell you all the story, I've no doubt. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Merry, Mr. Frodo and all, I'd best be turning for... Mrs. Maggot will be worrying with the night getting thick."
He backed the wagon into the lane and turned it.
"Well, good night to you all,"
He said.
"It's been a queer day, and no mistake. But all's well that ends well, though perhaps we should not say that until we reach our own doors. I'll not deny that I'll be glad now when I do."
He lit his lanterns and got up. Suddenly he produced a large basket from under the seat.
"Oh, I was nearly forgetting,"
He said.
"Mrs. Maggot put this up for Mr. Baggins, with her compliments."
He handed it down and moved off, followed by a chorus of thanks and good nights. They watched the pale rings of light round his lanterns as they dwindled into the foggy night. Suddenly Frodo laughed. From the covered basket he held, the scent of mushrooms was rising.
Now we had better get home ourselves,
said Mary.
There's something funny about all this, I see, but it must wait till we get in.
They turned down the ferry lane, which was straight and well kept, and edged with large whitewashed stones. In 100 yards or so it brought them to the river bank, where there was a broad wooden landing stage. A large flat ferry boat was moored beside it. The white bollards near the water's edge glimmered in the light of 2 lamps on high posts. Behind them, the mists in the flat fields were now above the hedges, but the water before them was dark, with only a few curling wisps like steam among the reeds by the bank. There seemed to be less fog on the further side. Mary led the pony over a gangway onto the ferry, and the others followed. Mary then pushed slowly off with a long pole. The Brandywine flowed slow and broad before them. On the other side the bank was steep, and up it a winding path climbed from the further landing. Lamps were twinkling there. Behind loomed up the Buck Hill, and out of it, through stray shrouds of mist, shone many round windows, yellow and red. They were the windows of Brandy Hall, the ancient home of the Brandybucks. Long ago, Gorhendad Oldbuck, head of the Oldbuck family, one of the oldest in the Marish or indeed in the Shire, had crossed the river, which was the original boundary of the land eastwards. He built and excavated Brandy Hall, changed his name to Brandybuck, and settled down to become master of what was virtually a small independent country. His family grew and grew, and after his days continued to grow until Brandy Hall occupied the whole of the low hill and had 3 large front doors, many side doors, and about 100 windows. The Brandybucks and their numerous dependents then began to burrow, and later to build, all round about. That was the origin of Buckland, a thickly inhabited strip between the river and the old forest. A sort of colony from the Shire. Its chief village was Bucklebury, clustering in the banks and slopes behind Brandy Hall. The people in the Marish were friendly with the Bucklanders, and the authority of the master of the hall, as the head of the Brandybuck family was called, was still acknowledged by the farmers between Stock and Rushy. But most of the folk of the old Shire regarded the Bucklanders as peculiar, half foreigners as it were, though as a matter of fact they were not very different from the other hobbits of the Four Farthings, except in one point. They were fond of boats, and some of them could swim. Their land was originally unprotected from the east, but on that side they had built a hedge, the High Hay. It had been planted many generations ago, and was now thick and tall, for it was constantly tended. It ran all the way from Brandywine Bridge in a big loop curving away from the river to Haysand, where the Withywindle flowed out of the forest into the Brandywine. Well over 20 miles from end to end. But of course, it was not a complete protection. The forest drew close from the hedge in many places. The Bucklanders kept their doors locked after dark, and that also was not usual in the Shire. The ferry boat moved slowly across the water. The Buckland shore drew nearer. Sam was the only member of the party who had not been over the river before. He had a strange feeling as the slow, gurgling stream slipped by. His old life lay behind in the mists. Dark adventure lay in front. He scratched his head, and for a moment had a passing wish that Mr. Frodo could have gone on living quietly at Bag End. The 4 hobbits stepped off the ferry. Merry was tying it up, and Pippin was already leading the pony up the path, when Sam, who had been looking back as if to take farewell of the Shire, said in a hoarse whisper, "Mr. Frodo, do you see anything?" On the far stage, under the distant lamps, they could just make out a figure. It looked like a dark black bundle left behind, but as they looked, it seemed to move and sway this way and that, as if searching the ground. It then crawled, or went crouching back into the gloom beyond the lamps.
What in the Shire was that?
Exclaimed Merry.
Something that's following us.
Said Frodo.
But don't ask any more now. Let's get away at once.
They hurried up the path to the top of the bank, but when they looked back, the far shore was shrouded in mist, and nothing could be seen.
Thank goodness you don't keep any boats on the west bank,
said Frodo.
Can horses cross the river?
Oh, they can go 20 miles north of the Brandywine Bridge.
or they might swim," answered Merry, "though I never heard of any horse swimming in the Brandywine. But what have horses to do with it?"
I'll tell you later. Let's get indoors and then we can talk.
All right. You and Pippin know your way, so I'll just ride on and tell Fatty Bulger that you're coming. We'll see about supper and things.
We had our supper early with Farmer Maggot, said Frodo. But we could do with another.
You shall have it. Give me that basket,
said Merry, and rode ahead into the darkness. It was some distance from the Brandywine to Frodo's new house at Crickhollow. They passed Buck Hill and Brandy Hall on their left, and on the outskirts of Bucklebury struck the main road of Buckland that ran south from the bridge. Half a mile northward along this, they came to a lane opening on their right. This they followed a couple of miles as it climbed up and down into the country. At last, they came to a narrow gate in a thick hedge. Nothing could be seen of the house in the dark. It stood back from the lane in the middle of a wide circle of lawn, surrounded by a belt of low trees inside the outer hedge. Frodo had chosen it because it stood in an out-of-the-way corner of the country, and there were no other dwellings close by. You could get in and out without being noticed. It had been built a long while before by the Brandybucks, for the use of guests or members of the family that wished to escape from the crowded life of Brandy Hall for a time. It was an old-fashioned, countrified house, as much like a hobbit hole as possible. It was long and low, with no upper story, and it had a roof of turf, round windows, and a large round door. As they walked up the green path from the gate, no light was visible. The windows were dark and shuttered. Frodo knocked on the door, and Fatty Bulger opened it. A friendly light streamed out. They slipped in quietly and shut themselves and the light inside. They were in a wide hall with doors on either side. In front of them, a passage ran back down the middle of the house.
"Well, what do you think of it?"
asked Merry, coming up the passage.
"We've done our best in a short time to make it look like home. After all, Fatty and I only got here with the last cartload yesterday."
Frodo looked round. It did look like home. Many of his own favorite things, or Bilbo's things, they reminded him sharply of him in their new setting, were arranged as nearly as possible as they had been at Bag End. It was a pleasant, comfortable, welcoming place, and he found himself wishing that he was really coming here to settle down in quiet retirement. It seemed unfair to have put his friends to all this trouble, and he wondered again how he was going to break the news to them that he must leave them so soon, indeed at once. Yet that would have to be done that very night, before they all went to bed. It's delightful, he said with an effort. I hardly feel that I have moved at all. The travellers hung up their cloaks and parted.